Um, Back in 2020, actually, I was asked by the experts from Swiss runners and the Swiss athletics, so these are sports people, is it safe that we still conduct outdoor running races and athletic events? And my first feeling was, well, you're running outdoors, you're in the clean air, nobody's around. Sounds okay, but hold on. There are races, these are popular runs. There are other people around. Sometimes they are like this, but it can get crowded, actually, very crowded. When is it too crowded? When is the risk too high? Is it actually too high at certain occasions or not? I wasn't so sure anymore. So I said, let me look into this. So I tried to find out what the literature tells. I found this beautiful study. It's still available as a preprint only, unfortunately, by a group around Blocken who did a fluid dynamics. They simulated the slipstream behind runners. You see how the air is dragged along by these people as they run, and they submitted aerosols into this slipstream. Well, they took only the larger ones, the 40 to 200 micrometers. And the question is also, what proportion actually reaches the back runner? So people that know me, they know I'm a hygienist. I'm totally interested in emission rates, transfer rates, exposure doses. So I want to know actually how much of what gets out actually reaches at the end, the person behind. So to understand, I try to continue. What do we know about the transfer of respiratory aerosols? We know how they are created. Let's look at this first. When you inhale and exhale, you have in the lower part of your lungs, you have these terminal bronchioles and the alveoli. And when you inhale, when you exhale, you actually increase the pressure on your thorax. And these small parts of tissue, they just collapse. And the only thing that separates the walls is a tiny layer of liquid that contains surfactant, which is kind of a soapy substance. When you now inhale, they open and they make bubbles that will burst eventually and let the air through. And these bursting bubbles create some liquid droplets, some aerosols, and a small fraction of that get actually exhaled at the next time you complete your breathing cycle. Another more important mechanism is happening actually in your vocal cords. Here we look into your vocal cords from above. Here the vocal cords are open. These are these slight brownish parts in the inner side. They are held there with muscles to keep control of your tension. Why do you have control over the tension of these vocal cords? Because when you are speaking, they're closing and the muscles control how much they vibrate, and with this you make your sounds. And while you make your sound, you also have similar effects happening as I showed just before in the alveoli. Here you have also like all your mucus and your spit is like vibrating on and off, and a part of that becomes airborne. And in fact, already just in the fine aerosol part, you have about 10 to 100 times more emission by the vocal cord activation than you have from the breathing. Now, when we look at this in terms of size distribution, these different factors, you have the blue dashed line here, the contribution by your alveolar part. So you have a very large number, the highest number in terms of peak number actually coming from the alveolar part, but in terms of absolute numbers and also especially concerning volume, you have much more from the vocal cords and the airways. You see also there are two bumps here. It's a bimodal distribution. You have one of quite fine aerosols and one of larger aerosols. And I like to compare these two types of aerosols with either being a fog or being a spray aerosol. So the fog, that's something that you know from your theater or from the discotheque. These are typical types of fogs that you can use. And the spray, you may know if you have a garden and you like to spray your roses. When you're indoors, we know that it's the fine aerosol that really matters for our health. I simulated here a game, a round of Yas game. That is a popular card game in Switzerland. And already after 30 seconds, if you sit next to this person, you are sitting in the middle of a cloud. And about 2 to 3 minutes later, the entire room will be filled with this dense fog. And if you spend here a prolonged time in this room, you have a very high chance of getting infected. The only way how you really can counter this is to ventilate well and to put on a well-fitting mask, FFP2 or better, I would recommend in the times of Omicron. The spray is considered not important. It falls quickly to the floor. So here I show you the experiment. It's not so well visible with the contrast on this picture, but I marked where the droplets fall to the ground when I spray at the height of my face. It goes about 1.2 meters far. Almost nothing, if anything at all, will get on your pants if you stand there, and for sure nothing will reach your face. So 1.2 meters is quite a safe distance against this spray. How does it look outdoors? Look at the dial here, that's meters per second indicated in this instrument that actually comes from Taiwan. It says here 0.25 meters per second. So that's a very mild breeze. It's something you barely recognize as being wind. And if I spray, you see how it's carried away. It easily reaches the end of this hedge in my garden. That's about 15 meters. Just continue straight. So we are no longer in a situation where it's physically impossible, but we reach a situation where you have to wonder about probabilities. So how many droplets do we exhale in reality when we breathe, talk, run, and so on? And how much of that load that comes out reaches you at the end? Still, let's come back to the running question. Does either of these two routes play a role when we run outdoors? This is now the topic of my talk, and you can also read it in more detail in the article that was just published in AAQR. So my experiments were to go running in a bulk of runners. I had here 7 volunteers that were willingly following me on my e-bike when I released either theoretical fog or pesticide with a pesticide color with a pesticide sprayer. I made rounds on an athletics track at different speeds. I used either fog or spray as a source. That's just for practicability reasons. I had only one head at the time for one type of spray, and I repeated, of course, multiple times. It was a bit tricky last year because of the 10 reservation days that I had on this track ground. I had to cancel many of them because of heavy rain, continuous heavy rainfalls. But I still managed to get enough repetitions to tell you something valuable. So here, let me present the test dummies, just plywood boards with a mirror that they use to attach blotting paper, and find dust sensors were attached behind the mirrors and connected to a logging computer. The theoretical fog I used to assess how many aerosols are transferred. For this, for generating the fog, I used a vaporizing fog generator, of which I had determined before the emission rate in a wind tunnel. So I knew if at what rate I go through the tunnel, what concentrations I receive, so I could calculate back what is the emission rate. I measured the fog with small sensors. These are SPS 30 from Sensirion. Up front already, I reached concentrations that are far above the coincidence level of these sensors, but fortunately the sensor goes very high up than with giving you quite linear readings, so you can easily still determine the dilution factor, even if you are not so certain anymore about the absolute values. I mentioned maybe I used here a little cover that actually is designed after studies they did in aerospace to make sure that there are no pressure differences over the openings of the sensor, which is important for the correct measurement. For the spray, I used red food colorant and put it into a water propylene glycol mixture. I used propylene glycol so that I can mimic to some extent the hydrophilic nature of our exhaled breath. You may remember the talk of Lindsay Marr, where she mentioned that they are not just liquids that are drying completely in a very short time, but they stay kind of stable, and I try to mimic this with this. I weighed the spray container with the attached nozzle and everything before and after each experiment. I tried the blotting paper afterwards. Once it was dry and back in the lab, I analyzed the color intensity on this paper. And then I compared the intensity with calibration curves and calculated at the end how much is actually deposited in the mouth and eye region of this dummy. I also logged weather and activities just to have track of that. And here also already the first result. If you are the source, you are also the target. You get the biggest load. But if you are just 1 meter back on the side, you also get quite some load. Further back, it quickly goes down with what you receive. Here are the data. We see for the fog that occasionally we have very high transfers at close distance. And as the distance increases, we have less. We see the same in principle, not so clear for the spray. We see also that for the fog, there is with higher speed, there is less transfer, while for the spray, there is with higher speed, more transfer. And this also makes kind of sense. If you think of the flow field that we generate with our moving bodies, when we have fog, we will just disperse it. Finally, we will dilute it effectively. While with the spray, you increase the chance that you are still reaching a droplet before it falls down to the floor. You can also see from this data that we have quite some lateral variation. So whether you are directly behind the person, where you receive much more, or you're on the side, makes already quite a difference. So far we learned from these experiments that there are only few brief peaks of fog with really elevated transfer rates. With transfer rates that I would be worried if it was continuously in an indoor environment. But these are very brief peaks, usually a second or two, and then it's again down to very rather low levels. So fog may not be that relevant. And we see that color droplets do land in the face. But if you look here at the proportion, that is like the median is around 1% or less, clearly less. Is it a lot? Is it enough? Well, we'll have to find out. So we have now to translate this into the risk when you go to an athletics event or a large popular run. How I simulated this is I took data from the Swiss City Marathon in Lucerne, and I took the times of the runner and I assigned running times to start times to runners. So for example, said runner 1 starts at 9 o'clock, and then I looked up the running table and saw, okay, this runner had 44 minutes and 30 seconds, and that was then actually the real race time. And I looked at each 10-meter segment, what is the race time, the time that the person reaches that marker. I did this for every of these runners in this race, took randomly a time from the running table, and then they proceeded like this, depending on the starting sequence that they wanted to study. Within each of these 10-meter segments, I first ask, are two runners together in that segment? So I compare pairwise all of these runners that participate, and I ask, are they together in the segment? Who is in front in this segment? Then I look at the speed of the person behind. So you see it's a simplification. I assume for these periods that they are having the same speed. And I looked at the distance and at the emission strength. And then I took from the distribution that I had obtained from the experiments, I took the transfer rate for that distance speed combination and assigned it for this period, for the period inside this segment, both for fog and for spray. I did a simplification by just assuming that this transfer rate is stable throughout these 10 meters, which is of course not always true. If a fast runner passes a slow one, he may pass the person before they are out of this 10-meter segment. But in other cases, you will have people spend much more time behind each other. So it's a simplification, but otherwise the computing time would have gotten too big. Already this way, it took me for one single race pattern about 10 hours to calculate. Now, I did not yet talk about the virus emission strength. So this is important. How much does this front runner number B actually emit? Let me get a little excursion into past studies where I looked at this question. In the initial time, when we had the wild type that came from Wuhan in China, we had most people emitting quite low levels. We had kind of a multimodal distribution actually, which I suspect came from the fact that that time already we had different variants floating around. And they were not yet sure which variant was actually preceding later. And over time, there were multiple variants coming, and later we had Delta variant. The distribution of the virus emission, while speaking quietly, and is actually quite large. So you see it's covering about 12 orders of magnitude. That's huge. How come? First is people, when they are sick, they have sometimes little virus in them, just a few thousand viruses per milliliter, all the way to extreme values, up to 10 to 11 viruses per milliliter. At the same time, we know that there is huge interpersonal difference between people that sometimes have very little aerosol emissions, sometimes much. If you combine this, you get to such a distribution. Now, what happened over time with these distributions is that we see a median shift. And first, let me explain again, here. So we have a certain part of the emissions that can lead in indoor spaces to aerosol levels that are sufficient to infect others. So now from the wild type to the Delta variant, we saw a shift in the median. This means we have already here more people actually that have get sufficient aerosol airborne. But even more worrisome is this little red part on the very right side that you barely see in the upper graph. These are the super emitters. Those where a few minutes in the same room are actually enough to make you potentially sick, especially if the person talks a lot. And these super emitters got with this shift about 30 times more frequent, which is quite relevant, of course, because the super emitters are the ones driving this pandemic. Another thing that we see with emerging variants, already with Delta, even more now with Omicron, that you actually need less virus to make other people sick. So we further actually increase the dose of this curve, or the people under the curve that are potentially infectious. We have more and more people in that range. So for the study, I used the most extreme simulation that I had done for the virus emission distribution. This was at the time when we knew very little about Omicron. And I used here a simulation where I assumed that this crazy emission variant has a 100 times higher median compared to delta. So I clearly use here a worst case modeling for this study. Now, I told you before how I did this simulation within a 10-meter segment. So I randomly picked a runner to be infected. I randomly assigned the running times to these different runners. And then within the segments, I took randomly a emission factor from those that matched the distance and the speed. And then I just repeated this. I took another runner, another race, assigned new running times, newly assigned who is infected, and recalculated and recalculated and recalculated this. This is the concept of Monte Carlo, where you have multiple strange distributions that you want to see what is combined, actually, the resulting distribution. And this allowed me not just to simulate the expected distribution for a certain race type, but it allowed me also to compare race sizes, race length, and starting patterns, which you need to know about if you want to take protective action. So before I get now to the results, we have to wonder what is actually a critical dose. So how much virus do you need to take up to get sick? We know from previous research that you need about 300 virus copies determined by RNA technology. So these are 300 identifiable mRNA, messenger RNA strands that you detect in your method. We need about 300 of those to see actually cells getting infected in cell culture experiments. Some of it can be because these virus copies were incomplete, actually, that they were just the mRNA strand that you detected and actually not the fully, completely put together virus. It could also be that not all of them managed to get into the cell. Now, if one single cell gets infected, you're unlikely to get sick. But we know that for SARS, it was about 16 of these PFUs, plaque forming units, and for Omicron, is a discussion that it could be only about 10 PFU necessary, and you get actually infected and you actually develop the disease. Interestingly, if you now combine these, and if I simulate earlier super spreading events by using a source modeling approach, so I use how many viruses we have, virus copies we have in our lining liquids. I calculate how much gets emitted and what other people inhale in these well-mixed rooms. I get to several thousand copies of what happened at the super spreading events. So if you look at these 300 times 10 times 16, you also get several thousand copies that are necessary to make people sick. It's quite funny, actually, how these two totally different approaches come to the same conclusion. Now, for the critical dose, we add a safety factor, and we also account for Omicron. And so this brings us to about 100 virus copies that are above which it starts to be critical, where you start to have an increased risk of getting sick. And for risk groups, such as people like immunocompromised, we should go down another factor 10 to about 10 virus copies. So now let's look at what is the dose that we see. We had these two processes, the fine fog aerosol cloud that reaches you, and the second is these large spread aerosol droplets that come on your mucosa. In our simulation, or in my simulation, I simulated first 100 runners running in a block, and I looked at 3 different prevalence rates first, 0.25, 1%, and 10%. When you look at the dose that you receive from the fog on average across all the runners, which is kind of, yeah, how useful is that? I'm doubtful. But when you look at the mean fog dose, you see clearly that if the prevalence increases, you have an increase of the dose that you receive. When we look at the maximum that you have, how much one person on maximum gets, that's now we're getting closer, just hang on. Then you have about 55 viruses if you have a 0.25% prevalence. If 10% of the runners are infected and still running, you have gone above the critical dose. The situation looks much different for the spray dose. There you have already at the low prevalence rate, very high, very relevant dose. You have already there the 10% runners infected. You have about the mean already quite high. But again, we have the maximum spray dose that's much more interesting. It's far above the critical dose. So if you are being hit, if you are one of those people getting the maximum spray dose, you're very likely to get sick. So clearly, during outdoor running, spray is the key. Now, I looked at the different race times. I looked at few people running, many people running. I looked at people starting a few at a time or starting as one block. Now, when we look again at this 10-kilometer race with a mass start of 100 people, and this time only at the number of infected people that were in this race, I looked here, I have here this data, and on the x-axis you see the number of infected people in the race. On the y-axis you see the proportion of runners getting a certain dose. That's much more relevant. You want to know what is the dose of the individual and to tell whether this individual can get infected. The average actually doesn't tell you much. And you see that you have, with increasing number of people in the race, you start to have an increasing proportion of runners getting actually quite high doses. You start to have about 3.5% when you have 16 of the 100 runners are infected. You are having 10 virus copies per received. So, but if you look at the doses that are more critical about this blue diamond, you start to see that it's actually quite low, the percentage. And if you look at the thousands, they are even lower. Now let's now look at the impact of the number of runners. So here I show you the results for running 10 kilometers, all start together, either 100, 500 or 100,000 people. If you are having a small block start, you have a risk estimate of about 0.2. What does this tell you? If you have one person infected in the race, then you will have in every 5th race, 1 in 5 races, another person get infected. So it takes you 5 races, each with one runner infected running along until you have somebody sick. Whereas in the 1,000 person race, you have this risk estimate being 1. So here you say you have one runner in your race and there's an extra person who got infected. So clearly size does matter. Now look at the starting regime. Here I started the runners in mini groups of every 2 seconds, one person every second starting out. So they're just running, one every second. And this effect brings us down to the same, the 1,000 kilometer person race brings us down to the same effect as if we had them just run as a 100 person block. So we have a 5-fold decrease. I also looked at the impact of trailing. So what if you have people there running very closely together? Here I simulated the 1.5 kilometer run, where 20 people run very closely together at 20 plus minus 2 kilometers per hour. So for each 10 meter segment, I took randomly a speed of 20 plus minus 2 kilometers for each of these runners and simulated a race over a short distance. And here you see it's a 0.25, as a 0.2, the risk estimate. It's also quite low. It's not, it's higher if you would think that it's actually a 1.5 kilometer race and not a 10 kilometer race. But if you have these people run in a fixed formation, so that means they are always the same person in the front, the same people behind until the last one, something that you would see in a pacemaker race during a marathon, then you have a risk estimate of 3. So for every one infected participant, you have actually 3 additional ones getting sick, which is not so ideal. It's actually critical. And I also looked at multi-blocks of runners. So if we have 500 people run all together, we have this risk estimate of 0.6. When we have 5 blocks of 100 together, we have a risk estimate 0.2, which is the same as if we had them start at 1 every 2 seconds. That's what I showed you before. And now the interesting part is we can further combine now this strategy. Here we learn blocks is actually interesting. So if we actually now reduce these blocks, take these individual blocks of 100 people and have them run individually instead of one block, we can further cut by half the risk. So taken together, we can see that the infection risk at an outdoor running event is quite low. This is of course provided that you don't have a prolonged slipstream running behind other runners. So the moment that you are just occasionally passing others, you're not at big risk. The recommendation is that we have is first start in small groups or make individual starts, or even better, combine them. So make, like, for example, a block of 100 every 2 seconds, 2-3 minutes, pause, the next block every 2-3 seconds, and so on, until your entire race is through. Then take measures against slipstream running. So for example, you can set the rule that that you have to pass other runners on the side with a minimum distance, for example, of 1 or 2 meters. Better 2 meters, that you are really outside of this particle stream. And you can do testing. You test all the runners before they start their running. And if you do a pacemaker run, you better take a very good testing method to make sure that none of these runners is infected. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I thank Swiss Runners and Swiss Athletics for their financial support, and the Swiss City Marathon of Lucerne, who provided me the typical running times, and also the pictures that you saw at the beginning, they came from the Swiss City Marathon. And as mentioned before, this was published recently in AAQR. So thank you for your attention, and now I have time to take your questions.
So thanks, Michael, for an interesting talk. So any questions like on site or online? Is there any questions? Okay, yeah, and I think generally for the talk, it's very interesting, and the design is quite good. And I like to ask you about what's the exercise pattern. For example, it's like how these participate by using like mouth breathing or like nose breathing. So do you think this kind of like different breathing patterns could affect the transmission risk as well?
Well, in theory, I think it could lead to some differences. But if you go for a running event, most people actually will become mouth exhalers at least. We also, I did not mention this, I think I forgot to mention this, that the distribution that you see for exercising, the exhalation is very similar to what I showed there with the singing or talking. So you also have this activation of the vocal cords. It's similar to like low-level speaking, which kind of makes sense, because if you ever heard somebody participate in a run, you can actually hear them breathing. It's like this. Some people will breathe a bit heavier than others, but this, of course, also generates aerosols.
Yes, so I think that is quite a good point, because for the infected patients, they've got probably like a lung impairment due to the infection. So for breathing pattern, that should be slightly different when compared with the normal subject, right? So this point, probably based on the different breathing pattern, more aerosols could be kind of like exhaled doing this kind of exercise, which could lead to more risk or higher risk for people infections by the surrounding subject. And the other thing is, how do you think, what's the preventive strategy for COVID-19 infections during the exercise? Should we wear a mask during the exercise, do you think?
Well, if you are in an outdoor running race, if it's an organized race, actually what Swiss runners did in this last year, they had mandated testing and also wearing masks, as long as there were still masks around in Switzerland. Unfortunately, this measure was dropped here, and you see it now with the resurgence of the peaks. But so I didn't talk about the entire thing around it, but while you are not running, definitely wear a mask. Once you are on the race and you keep this additional prescription of passing people at sufficient distance and not trailing others, then I think it's sufficiently safe to run without a mask. It's different if you go indoors. Indoors, I would recommend that as long as you are not in an outstandingly ventilated place, that you put on a mask and that you adjust your exercise goals accordingly. So we know there is some psychological, but also breathing resistance changes that you have, and exercising with a mask, with a good fitting, very tight mask, can be at times a bit difficult. I experienced this myself when I did handball trainings with a FFP2 mask on. You just get much quicker tired than with what you have without the mask. But I would recommend to put on a mask at the moment, yes.
Okay, good. So any questions from the audience? Okay, no. So in the end, I would like to say thanks to Michael for the wonderful talk, and hope can see you in Taiwan or in other countries in the near future. Okay, see you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that we will be back again in the future in Real.